Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, January 28th, 2020, and today we're going to be discussing what to expect from the Iowa caucus. Now, I know we're about a week away, but I think that since we're getting very close to our first Democratic caucus or primary, that I'm going to cover what we might expect from the state of Iowa. Now, in the entire grand scheme of things, Iowa does not actually matter. It has very few delegates compared to the amount that are needed to win, around 1,900 something, and there's only 41 delegates in Iowa, but Iowa sets the stage for the rest of the primary season. In 2016, Hillary Clinton almost lost the state of Iowa to Bernie Sanders despite leading in early polling data. Right now, Bernie Sanders is leading in early polling data, and it looks like he might actually do better than we are expecting. Right now, this is the current trend. Bernie Sanders has pretty much skyrocketed up in the past couple of days, and it's happening all around the nation. Joe Biden is at one of his lowest points of margin of victory at the nationwide level at 5% nationwide. Bernie Sanders is now leading in two of the early states, coming up close in Nevada, too far behind in South Carolina, but not impossible. And we could likely see this end up being a push for a Bernie Sanders nomination, and it's not too hard to believe. Bernie Sanders has had just the right push in the last couple of days. These last few days will determine how the state of Iowa turns out. If you don't know how the caucus system works in the state of Iowa, essentially people stay with who they are choosing to vote for. It's not exactly like a primary. You don't go in and just vote. You have to stay there for a pretty long period of time. One thing that people do mention is that this does impact older voters. Obviously, they're not going to be as energetic and as willing to stay in an area for, a number of hours compared to younger voters, which is exactly why Bernie Sanders is expected to do better here and does do better in caucuses than primaries based off the 2016 data. And if you take a look at Iowa, again, not super impactful, but definitely could build momentum for the Sanders campaign. In the recent 3 out of the 4 polls, Bernie Sanders leads, and by some of them nearing double digits in the Emerson poll and the New York Times Siena poll. Joe Biden is actually in a race for third place. Yes, he's pretty solid up there, 5% lead over Pete Buttigieg, but at a point in time, Pete Buttigieg did lead the state. But I am worried for Pete Buttigieg because people do have the right to campaign during these caucuses and convince the other side to move over to their side of the caucus. So let's say there's 10 Bernie Sanders supporters, 3 Joe Biden supporters. Let's say those Bernie Sanders supporters want to get over more voters, so they aim at the Joe Biden supporters and pretty much convince them to move over into their area. Now, if that does happen, by the end of the day, Bernie Sanders would get a higher percentage of the vote. This is not exactly like a primary season election. I don't know why I said season. You don't just go in and out. You actually have to stay there, and that's something where I think that candidates like Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Andrew Yang are not going to see as much support as they are expecting from the state of Iowa. A lot of those candidates who are saying whose candidates they may be doing well in this particular state, but when you think about it in the long run, a lot of these people that are here voting or caucusing for these candidates are going to think to themselves, can this candidate actually make it past Iowa? Sure, I can stay here for as long as I want, but will my vote at the end of the day matter if my candidate doesn't make it past Iowa? And that's something that actually impacted in 2016, impacted Martin O'Malley. He polled at 4%, peaked at 6%, 4% on election day, ended up getting 0.5%. If it was a primary, I would expect these numbers to be a lot closer than they, not a lot closer. Actually, yes, a lot closer to the polling results than anything else. O'Malley was supposed to make or break this race, and looking at it, he kind of did. If those O'Malley voters had went somewhere else, it is possible Bernie Sanders could have won the Iowa caucus compared to Hillary Clinton. But Hillary Clinton ended up winning it by 0.2%. Very, very close. Polling data expected her to win by 4%, but her lead drastically went down. The same thing we saw with Joe Biden, except this time Bernie Sanders is now on top. And O'Malley's voters, again, if it was just a primary, we probably would have seen 4% of the vote go to O'Malley. But since a lot of those people were probably pressured or just moved because they didn't think O'Malley would actually make it past the state of Iowa, that left 0.5% of the vote for Martin O'Malley. I see the same exact thing possibly happening with Andrew Yang, Tom Steyer, Tulsi Gabbard, Amy Klobuchar possibly. She's at 8.5% sure because of her, area from Minnesota. Definitely helps right on top of the state of Iowa. Definitely could help her campaign. But in the long run, Amy Klobuchar is barely doing well nationwide. I think she's at 4%, 5th or 6th place nationwide, or 6th or 7th actually. That's not the best place to be in if you're going to convince these voters that you can make it past this primary stage. But let's take a look at the area around Iowa, this general, rural area, Midwest type of vibe for a lot of these states. Well, Iowa, you can see, went to Hillary Clinton, and so did Illinois and Missouri, but the surrounding states, except for South Dakota, went to Bernie Sanders. Now, this may seem, obviously, like a stretch. Iowa is not going to determine how Wisconsin or Minnesota or Illinois votes, but it is something to look at, that these states generally have the same interests, Democrat or Republican. Same thing in the general election, even though they don't always vote together, though in recent history. I guess you could say the only states, the ones that I mentioned, only 2 of them went to the Democrats in 2016. But besides that, they definitely have similar interests, and a lot of these candidates that are, let's say, appealing to voters in Indiana are appealing to the same voters in Iowa or Ohio or Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. Take, for example, Pete Buttigieg, a mayor from a small town in Indiana, is doing well in Iowa, also doing well in Illinois, and it could be a regional advantage. It can also be the fact that he's doing well amongst white voters, which make up the majority of these Democratic voters in these states as well. So if you're winning here, you're winning the majority of the Democratic electorate. And that's really good for candidates like Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or Elizabeth Warren, because they need to win more of the whiter voters. Joe Biden definitely needs so if he wants to clinch the nomination outright. It's probably not going to happen. Joe Biden is the strongest Democrat for minority voters just because of the Obama legacy and the policies that he stands for. Definitely aligns a lot more with minority viewpoints as a whole, which is exactly what Hillary Clinton did back in 2016 that led her to winning the nomination process. If you take a look at this map, Bernie Sanders dominated the predominantly white states: Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, North Dakota. Yes, Hillary Clinton did win some predominantly white states, but if you take a look at the areas that were really, really solid for her and will be really, really solid for candidates not like Bernie Sanders, for example, Joe Biden, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, a lot of those states were pretty solid for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Mainly because of her ties to President Barack Obama. So, just taking a look at the 2016 map, we're going to see a very similar pattern emerge for 2020. Guarantee it, by the time we hit around Super Tuesday or right after Super Tuesday, it will narrow down to possibly a 4-person race, likely a 3 or 2-person race though. And obviously Bernie Sanders is going to be up there. Joe Biden will likely be up there. Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg. Michael Bloomberg, he's doing well, but Buttigieg is definitely going to outperform him in a lot of these early states. So we might see his name emerge a little bit more than we might see Bernie Sanders. But like I said, New Hampshire as well. Bernie Sanders is leading it by 8%. I mean, this is something that we saw in 2016. Bernie Sanders last minute took a very strong lead in New Hampshire and ended up winning it by a very, very large amount. But once we hit Nevada, it's looking a little bit better for Joe Biden, though the most recent poll shows him with a 1% lead. Not exactly the most reassuring numbers, but South Carolina we do expect to do well for Joe Biden. As we continue, though, California now, Sanders is leading here in a most recent poll, Sanders +6. Texas as well. This is an area that I think Bernie Sanders will not do too well in. Joe Biden leads here by 12%. Massachusetts, again, I thought Warren would do amazing here. It actually looks like she's leading by 6.5%, but that's besides the point. A lot of these early states, looks like Sanders and Biden are really going to face off for the top spot. But if you take a look at this, just look right down here, this area that I'm focusing on, the lead for Joe Biden. It's been pretty strong. I mean, it's been 8%, 7%, and all of a sudden, the most recent, past 2 weeks, it's dipped down to 5.4% nationwide. Sure, he's at the same amount of support he was before, but Bernie Sanders is getting a very good increase for his campaign. It's only a couple of percentage points, but when the election is coming down to just a couple hundred delegates, that will make all the difference. Bernie Sanders is entering into Iowa and New Hampshire with momentum. Joe Biden really needs that if he wants to go ahead and focus on South Carolina, Nevada, other states. But Bernie Sanders is going into these states with a very strong campaign, and it looks like that whole thing with Elizabeth Warren may have hurt him temporarily. Very, very small decrease in his numbers, but it looks like he's right back on track. Elizabeth Warren, we could see soon fade out, along with Pete Buttigieg and Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg seems like he's on an uphill climb. He'll probably peak around 10, 12% nationwide, but I do not expect him to, skyrocket up to 30% or 20% unless something happens with a couple of other candidates. But pretty much all the other names right after Klobuchar are probably going to drop out sometime soon. Deval Patrick, John Delaney, Michael Bennett, Tulsi Gabbard, Tom Steyer. Not exactly the quote-unquote most electable names or plausible names for the 2020 Democratic nomination. So we are probably going to see an Iowa victory for Bernie Sanders in this state. Not unlikely, but if he does win in Iowa, it's going to build momentum into New Hampshire, possibly Nevada, and in his best case, South Carolina, and that would completely decimate the Joe Biden campaign. We'll see how this all turns out in 6 days from today. So thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all tomorrow.